Hello, everybody. Welcome this evening to the third night of Modern WNY. I am Christiana Limniadis. I'm the Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. This week is our fourth annual Modern WNY. It's our annual celebration of all things modern. For those of you who are new to Preservation Buffalo, new to Preservation Buffalo Niagara, we are your region's only full-service, professionally staffed historic preservation organization. Our mission is to provide leadership in identifying, protecting, and promoting our unique architecture and historic legacy, and connecting people to the places they love in Western New York. And so with this, our fourth annual Modern WNY, it's our opportunity to connect you to those modernist examples of architecture in our region. Before we get to the rest of the program, I do just want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight. We like to try to keep our programming low cost or free, and that's only made possible through sponsorships, donations, and PBN membership dollars. So I do just want to thank PBN membership, and certainly those of you who did make a donation when you registered for tonight's program. And I do want to just mention a few of the people that chose those supporter or sponsor ticket levels. That includes Terrence Bisson, Linda Brigance, Barbara Campagna, Christopher Corchensi, and Ian Danick. So thank you so much to those individuals. Again, this year is our fourth annual Modern WNY, celebrating the evolution of modernism in the area. And we're doing so through 2 self-guided tours, 1 in-person walking tour, and 3 virtual lectures. Like I said, tonight is our second lecture of the week. We had our first one on Monday evening. And then tomorrow, I hope you'll be able to join us for our final virtual lecture, which is Artifacts of the Future, where we'll explore space age design with researcher and space age expert Martin McGee. This Saturday, you will get to walk around Niagara Falls with this crazy lady, looking at the amazing modern structures of downtown Niagara Falls. And we'll also talk about a few of the buildings that have been lost over time as well. And then if crowds are not your bag, that's totally fine. Every year we produce 2 self-guided travel logs. Here are this year's travel logs. We have our annual Drive Yourself Modern, which picks a new group of 14 sites from across our 5-county region for you to be able to drive to and check out. And then this year we have our Rambling Ranches of LeBrun, which will take you on a walking tour of the Serpentine Road in the town of Amherst and the magical ranch-style homes that accent it. And now to our main event this evening, Gregory Delaney talking to us about the history and future of the Great Northern. We were just talking amongst ourselves how convenient it is, or not convenient or weird, that we are doing this tonight, since most of us have probably seen the news that demolition is scheduled to start tomorrow, unfortunately. Save some amazing gesture to stop that demolition. This is probably our last day to fully learn about and experience this building. So it's great that we can be here with Greg to learn about that. Greg Delaney is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Buffalo, where he teaches courses in architecture history, building and urban analysis, and studios in architecture and urban design. I'd like to mention that this presentation that he's doing this evening is based on a version that he first did for us back earlier this spring as part of our Lenses exhibit lecture series. And so we're really happy to invite him back to do it for Modern WNY, since we do know it had such an influence on the development of modern architecture. So with that, Greg. Oh, I have to unmute you because
I think I just did, yeah.
Oh, you just did. Excellent.
Good.
All right. With that, let me stop my screen share and let you get in there.
Awesome. Well, let me go ahead and start this. Okay. Can you see that all right? Is that good?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, first, let me say thank you so much to everyone at PBN and to you, Christy, and all of the amazing work that you do. And I felt so fortunate to be a part of the Lenses Speaker Series, and then also the Modern Western New York Speaker Series now. It is This building has been such a, big part of our conversations in Western New York and in Buffalo over the past now, going on 10 months since the December 11th windstorm that blew a hole into the north facade of the building. And so obviously that made the preservation of this building and that kind of active fight for preservation of this building really kind of top of mind for all of those that care about our history and places in Buffalo and in the region. And in this case, something, as Christy said, also that is so important, not just to our history here in Buffalo and Western New York, but really is a building that is, brings with it such an international significance. And so while, unfortunately, it seems as though demolition is rather imminent, although I will still in this talk about the opportunities in this building as if we, are still holding out some hope for any kind of last minute momentum there or, shift in direction. It is something that if you're not familiar with this building from a kind of up close and personal experience of it, I certainly recommend getting down to this site as soon as possible to see it because it seems like it's one we are about to very unfortunately lose. But nonetheless, I want to talk about the history of the building because as part of the Modern Western New York series, and as Christy mentioned, this building really, while it maybe is not a poster child as many of you might think of as for representing modernism in architecture as a movement. It is this building and also so many of the buildings around it down on our waterfront, the other grain elevators and daylight factories that played such a central role in establishing ideas, modern ideas and thinking in the first decades of the 20th century that really inspired that movement in Europe, and then also as it becomes exported and implemented all across the world. And so Buffalo plays an important, very actively important role in that story. And the Great Northern really is a building that commands a really central position in the development of the buildings that then inspired those generations of modern architects, and still really something today that we look back to as an important juncture in the development of thinking in the 20th century. So with that, I'm going to get started here. And I think that the Great Elevator, the Great Northern Grain Elevator, is of course part of a much larger industrial landscape. It's one that extends all along our waterfronts of Lake Erie, the Buffalo River, and traces of former ship canals, and up the Niagara River to Black Rock and the Tonawandas. And while some of this landscape remains industrial today, much of it has and is currently being reconsidered as a new form of cultural landscape, connecting our urban neighborhoods to a newly public waterfront defined by these inspired monuments of our industrial past. But the power of these sites, while certainly renewed in recent years through economic growth and development that now has a firm hold in the city of Buffalo, has been recognized for their entire histories. And thus, this industrial and cultural landscape has forever been a site of interest historically. And so here we see two historic postcards of grain elevators here in Buffalo, New York. Though I will say at a time when seemingly anything and everything was a site of interest for a postcard. That being said, here are two current postcards in Buffalo. And so nonetheless, we still have postcards of the grain elevators today that really evidence their kind of staying power and monumental presence that is so synonymous with our image of the city of Buffalo, New York. And while it's the landscape of concrete silos that we're most familiar with in Buffalo today, the Great Northern stands as a testament to the rich development of this typology and its associated innovations in a period of massive exponential growth of industry and labor in Buffalo associated with the transshipment of grain. And so I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of grain storage in Buffalo, as really it is a story that echoes across the world as we move from the 19th to the 20th centuries and begin to set things in motion for some of the modern developments there to follow. In this context, it's important not just to start with the 1842 invention of the grain elevator in Buffalo by Joseph Dart and Robert Dunbar, something probably many of you that are present here tonight are familiar with as part of our story in Buffalo. But to first discuss how grain was already being stored in Buffalo after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, as we start to import grain, first from Ohio, and then later the fellow kind of newly admitted states of the near Midwest, and begin moving that grain from the Great Lakes to the East Coast. And so here's a couple images just a little bit larger of these generally 3 to 4 story brick warehouses, actually called flat houses, in the area that's now known as Canal Side, but at the time, really is this broader, what developed as a canal district around the foot of the Erie Canal and also the harbor of the Buffalo River. These flat houses were buildings that were organized with traditional horizontal floor plates, where bagged grain was stored. And so at this time, grain was bagged, and the reason for that is so that it can be easily handled through human labor to then move grain from larger lake vessels into these flat houses, and also then to carry them back out again and load them up into canal boats like you see there on the left. And so then I want to kind of shift to then the evolution from these 2 to 3 story flat houses to then the grain elevator era that's associated with this period after the invention of this mechanized system, this kind of steam-powered electrified system for the grain elevator as it was invented in 1842 by Joseph Dart and Robert Dunbar. And so we'll kind of move through this era just to sort of just to establish a kind of framework for understanding the development of an architectural typology, a building typology associated with this advancement and innovation. And so this is the first of that new scale and new mechanized building type, which is the Dart elevator, named after Joseph Dart, of course, who was really the kind of financier and innovator behind the elevator. Robert Dunbar was the engineer that made all of that, this large idea possible. And the Dart elevator, built in 1842, as you see in this drawing on the left, and a kind of diagram of how that worked on the right, was a building with a storage capacity of 55,000 bushels of grain. And just as further evidence of how quickly the handling of grain and the speed at which the handling of grain was revolutionized through this mechanized system, that this elevator, the Dart elevator, actually already doubled in size just 3 years after its initial construction. So pretty amazing. It's important, I think, to mention, though, that while this sets up this kind of new typology for large scale silo construction, another term we associate with the grain elevators as silos, grain silos are really an ancient typology. And here's just one example from, thousands of years ago, 2000 to 1400 BCE, in the Minoan settlement on the island of Crete. And so this kind of problem, this architectural and building problem around the storage of grain, is an ancient problem. Ever since we began as human civilizations growing grain, we've also, what's come with that is the problem of storing grain. And so we have a kind of incredible wealth of examples of grain storage over the course of history. But what we see really advance with Dart and Dunbar's industrial mechanization of that process, we see this really rapid shift in scale. Of course, scale of operations in terms of movement and handling, but also then the scale of the silo as a building and as an emerging typology. And so not only do we have Dart's elevator doubling in size, but quickly we see this entire new skyline spring up along the Buffalo River and this harbor of Buffalo at the terminus of the Erie Canal. Really this sort of city unto itself of enormous grain elevators that really form our first skyline. The first skyline of the city of Buffalo was this one, this 19th century skyline of these wooden grain elevator buildings along the Buffalo River. And these buildings are these enormous storage facilities for grain, where now, because you're no longer limited by the human ability to now carry, individually bagged, individual bags of grain, we now have the ability to grow vertically in a way that had never been possible before when you're constrained by the limitations of human labor, right? And so what we're really talking about with this, and you can see, I love this photograph from 1900 or thereabouts, where you can can see the big, really the kind of mechanism itself, which is the marine leg, which is what you see. I think you can probably see my mouse, what you see here on the left of the photograph, which is descended from the grain elevator building down into the hold of the ship, where it is then elevating grain along this conveyor belt system. And then it is moving that up to the top of these buildings to what's called a head house or a cupola to then distribute the grain into individual silos. And so, and these were buildings of wooden construction, which was also a very rapid construction technology, also a very expedient, not just expedient in terms of labor, but also in terms of skill of labor associated with the construction of these buildings. And so you see these begin to spring up. And there, what I love about this photograph too is you see this, this kind of duality of scale of the earlier flat house warehouse typologies there at the foot of the Erie Canal, alongside now what we've seen in the second half of the 19th century emerge this much larger, more inflated vertical scale of this wooden silo construction after 1842. A bit about the Darts elevator itself. The original marine leg of Darts elevator spaced what were effectively buckets and referred to as buckets, these kind of metal buckets affixed to the conveyor belt system. Those were buckets spaced 28 inches apart. Each bucket held 2 quarts of grain, and through this mechanized process, Dart and Dunbar were able to raise 1,000 bushels of grain per hour. And so this entirely revolutionized the handling of grain in terms of labor, volume, speed, storage, and thus also economy. Dart tells the story, and he kept pretty amazing records, and he tells the story of a schooner named John B. Skinner, who came into the Buffalo Harbor with 4,000 bushels of wheat in the early afternoon to Dart's elevator. And by early evening, and so just a few hours later, all grain had been unloaded and a ballast of salt reloaded into that vessel for Skinner to return to the port of Huron, Ohio, which is west of Cleveland, a distance of about actually over 200 miles. He then loaded back up with grain, returned to Buffalo, unloaded that grain, reloaded with ballast, to then return again, only this time finally traveling back with the vessels who initially arrived at the same time as he did, who had only just now finished their first unloading. So pretty amazing to think that, 2 unloadings happened and reloading, and also then this distance of over 400 miles total traveled in the span of time it just took to unload the rest of the vessels in the traditional methods. And so you can really see how this instantly revolutionized grain transshipment and storage here in Buffalo, and demand for these faster methods for movement and handling of grain. And here's just a more modern image to show how this technology really prevailed into the 20th century. And also as emblematic of this larger story of labor, of the scoopers and stevedores, largely Irish immigrants in the city of Buffalo that fueled and kind of operated, this industry. And actually then leading up to 1900, of course, as this, we see this great rise in industry and also then rise in population, Buffalo then kind of finds its place as the 8th largest city in the US, which also really kind of demonstrates the significance, the wealth of the city, the kind of innovation of the city, and this booming population and industry and economy. But I want to kind of come back to 1865 at this point, and this image is from 1880, but it's close-ish. And so you can see in this 1880 depiction of Buffalo, you can see the density of the city, but here you can really clearly see this first skyline of the city in these wooden silo constructions along the Buffalo River and the City Ship Canal and all of the canals that form the harbor. But by 1865, Buffalo was home to 29 elevators, some of which were storing 600,000 bushels of grain, and altogether stored 6 million bushels of grain. And at that time, capable of moving more grain in a single day than it was in an entire year just 20 years before, in 1842, when Joseph Dart and Dunbar invented the grain elevator. And so that's amazing. In just the span of 20 years, we're moving in our city more grain in a day than we were able to in a year just 2 decades before. And on March 13th, 1865, Joseph Dart delivered a talk to the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society titled The Grain Elevators of Buffalo. And so this was now 157 years ago. And in this talk, he's actually effectively using this talk as part of his campaign at the time to patent his invention from 1842, which actually ultimately was unsuccessful, which is another kind of interesting side story in all of this. And so through this, he really begins this talk by situating the invention of the grain elevator in global terms, which on the one hand is, a kind of self-aggrandizement, as he, of course, is writing about himself and his own influence in the world. But on the other hand, it's really true, as this invention born in Buffalo will indelibly remain a milestone moment in the paradigm shift from a local and regional food economy to a national and international global food economy, and forever changing the landscape of global food production and consumption, for better or worse. But nonetheless, it is for this reason and these buildings' broader influences that we'll discuss later that the grain elevator remains very arguably Buffalo's greatest contribution to the world, at least in terms of direct kind of more measurable impact on a global scale. And he says in his opening, he says, "This subject has a bearing not only on the citizens of this community, but also upon an immensely larger number of people whose grain productions are sent and whose bread supplies are received through our hands. The first great care of humans commonly is to produce food, not to know what to do with it when produced. The road from hand to mouth is short and easy enough with humans at first, but as society grows and division of labor is made, producers and consumers of food become widely separated, and the question of transportation becomes exceedingly important. When the hands of producers and the mouths of consumers are distant by the space of half a continent and even half a globe, the road from hand to mouth is a long one, and oftentimes a hard road to travel. Whatever smooths the roughness of that road cheapens food and therefore benefits humankind." And so he's kind of laying out this innovation in global terms, but specifically also for the larger benefit of affordability, the affordability of food. And of course, we can talk about the other ramifications of that, but it's interesting to see how he's positioning his argument related to the influence of this invention here in Buffalo. And my lights are gonna always turn off, so forgive me. They're on an auto motion sensor, and so we'll deal with it. Sometimes they come back on, sometimes they don't. And so back to this talk. It is interesting, he makes no mention of Robert Dunbar, who's really, he's the mechanical engineer who made this all possible. But at the same time, he doesn't take full credit for the inception of this invention. Rather, he positions it as a clear and decided direct evolution of Oliver Evans's patented 18th century elevator and conveyor system for manufacturing flour. But also note that Oliver Evans had been successful in receiving his patent, even though actually Thomas Jefferson argued against it at the time. And so Dart is also positioning himself in line with Oliver Evans in the evolution of those technologies, also as a way to strengthen his argument for his patent. But the distinction he offers between him, in this case, is that as part of this unsuccessful attempt to obtain the patent, is that in this new application of this elevator and conveyor system, that it is, quote, commercial, as a commercial rather than a manufacturing appliance for facilitating the transshipment of grain, that some of the most useful inventions have not been discoveries of new principles or methods of mechanical action, but instead new applications of methods and principles already known. And so really it's that by applying this technology effectively in this new, as a kind of, as a commercial appliance, that this is really an invention that is then revolutionizing an industry. And so this was effectively also the case with Oliver Evans, where his invention was equally based on an old idea, actually traced back to antiquity, which is actually why Thomas Jefferson argued against his patent. And so nonetheless, there's no, I think there's this interesting story of innovation and the kind of evolution of these innovations. But with each of these steps, Oliver Evans before him and now Joseph Dart, that now are really broadening the application and thus the kind of success of that application to an entire industry. And he says, an inventor's merit consists not merely in conceiving an idea of a machine, but also in overcoming the practical difficulties in its successful operation. And certainly, no one can argue that that Dart did not do this, right? That certainly this is what happened in Buffalo, is the kind of fulfillment of this application in its successful operation. And so in 1825, as evidence of this, in 1825, of course, is when we have the opening of the Erie Canal. By 1835, we had annual receipts of grain handled in Buffalo totaling 112,000 bushels. In 1836, just 1 year later, we see that more than quadruple to annual receipts of 500,000 bushels. By 1841, already to 2 million bushels. And so Joseph Dart and Robert Dunbar, remember 1842 is the date of their invention, they're really also responding to this already exponential growth of grain handling in Buffalo as this epicenter of transshipment. But what we see after 1842 is really where that growth explodes in a way that would not have been otherwise possible. And so here in 1862, we see that number go from 2 million to 70 million. And we'll come back to this in a bit. And so at this point in time, through the kind of 1840s, 50s, and 60s, we really finally see also the fulfillment of Joseph Ellicott's plan for Buffalo, which Joseph Ellicott, and maybe what some people might not realize, is that not only did he lay out the center of the city, Niagara Square, Lafayette Square, Sheldon Square, the radials, and the city grid, he also actually laid out a canal district and foresaw the development of a canal district because he recognized Buffalo was at this critical, position in this juncture at the eastern end, the terminus of the Great Lakes, at least for the United States, and because the concept of the Erie Canal had already been established as early as 1724. And so amazing to see, the kind of seeds of this already baked, planted into the plan by Joseph Ellicott in the city of Buffalo. And so here we have then ultimately what that takes shape as. This is an 1872 map of the city of Buffalo, where we see that canal district now fully established around Commercial Slip in the Erie Canal. And here's the landscape of those wooden grain elevator buildings, these kind of skyscrapers of wooden construction for the move, the lifting, the elevating, and the storage of grain. And so this new skyline emerges and ultimately kind of carries us to the end of the 19th century. Here's just a few more photographs. Another interesting inclusion in his talk is this chart, which I think is really, it's really just an accounting of all 29 grain elevators that have been constructed in Buffalo in the 20 years since his own. But what it also reveals rather explicitly, even though no mention is made of this in the text, is one of the going typology's biggest problems, that it was inherently defective as a means of grain storage, these giant wooden buildings. Not only did the wooden construction of these buildings offer a breeding ground for vermin and rot, but they were also incredibly susceptible to total destruction by fire, which was frankly an unfortunate inevitability due to the high combustibility of grain, and especially when you pair that with the electrical process of its transfer as introduced by Dart and Dunbar. And so if we just highlight here, we can highlight all of those grain elevators that by this time had burned and were destroyed in these first 20 years. And again, while it's not meant to be the kind of takeaway from this chart, it's really hard not to see this as a kind of central takeaway, this revealing of this critical problem that already by the 1860s was so already well established in this first generation of wooden elevator constructions that really needed to be solved. All of these buildings really clearly had a very short lifespan. In fact, even Dart's own elevator was destroyed by fire just 2 years prior to this address in 1863. Again, this talk was delivered in 1865. And so, and even with the introduction of water sprinkler systems, which was common by 1890, and also the separation of boiler houses from the elevators, which was also a smart idea to kind of decouple those things, it was still clear that this building type, while affordable and expedient in construction, was no longer practical. And it became increasingly difficult to ensure. Here's just one example. This is the eastern elevator, still in 1895, so 30 whole years later, after we already know the problems of this building type. And this was the eastern elevator. It was the largest elevator upon completion for its time. It was built of 8 million board feet of timber and was destroyed entirely by fire within 4 years of its completion. And so actually it's Rayner Banham who later cites the figure of 12 to 15 years as the average lifespan of these wooden buildings before they would inevitably be destroyed by fire in the publication of his book, A Concrete Atlantis, which we'll also bring back up in a bit, published in 1986. And so that kind of moves us from, this kind of first half century into a transitional era, into this transitional period where when insurance companies stop insuring and this problem is more evident than ever, especially with things like that, the fire that we just talked about here at the eastern elevator. And so we move into this transitional era where we see engineers start to experiment with new building types in terms of construction and materials, and then also types in terms of overall form. And so we have at this time several grain elevators in Buffalo built that really evidence these experiments in material and construction technology. On the bottom, notably, is a series of 9 tile bin constructions from 1903, which are still exist as part of the General Mills complex, then Washburn Crosby. At the top, of course, the Great Northern, and in the middle, we have also a series of steel bin constructions that have since been demolished. And so here we've kind of entered this transitional era. And of course, the Great Northern takes its kind of most central and commanding seat in Buffalo as the building that most, that greatly represents, that most clearly represents the kind of concepts and the search for a new building type to solve these problems at the very end of the 19th century. 1897 is when the Great Northern is completed. And not only is it the oldest, as of today, of course, this could change starting tomorrow, but at this point, it is the oldest of all remaining grain elevators in Buffalo, but also it is an entirely unique and individually significant structure. In 1901, Engineering News cited the Great Northern specifically as one of the best and most important engineering works of modern times, period. Today, the building stands as possibly the only remaining of its type and construction in the world. The building itself was put into service in 1897, September 29th, 1897. This photograph was actually from the first 3 months of it being put into service. And when the Great Northern was completed, it was the largest grain elevator in existence in the entire world, with a total storage capacity of up to 3 million bushels. And just to kind of do the math, that means that that 54 of Dart's original grain elevators from 1842 would have to be constructed or would fit inside the Great Northern at the time of its completion. So this is equal to 54 of Dart's original grain elevators. It substitutes steel for wood in the construction of its bins. And we'll see a photograph that shows this more clearly. And of course, that's more visible today with the hole in its north facade. And so the bins themselves are of steel construction, of riveted boilerplate steel. The building is 400 feet long with a solid brick enclosing wall of 100 feet tall on the sides. But what's also amazing here then is actually it's the steel, the internal steel that forms all of the network of support for the building. And so it's a steel, it's an incredibly modern building for its time in terms of construction. In fact, it's constructed not unlike the skyscrapers being constructed like the Guarantee Building in downtown Buffalo, that is a steel frame, where you have this internal steel frame and also through the kind of tying together of all the steel bends, this cylindrical steel bends that actually comprise the structure of the building. So the brick wall that wraps this building is actually a brick curtain wall. And in fact, the term brick curtain wall was used historically to explain and describe the function of the brick as just kind of a mere enclosing wall, a weather protecting enclosing wall, no different, frankly, than how you might think of a glass curtain wall on a modern building today. So pretty amazing. And here's the plan of this building where you can see all of that at work a little more clearly. And frankly, I think it's one of the most beautiful plans in the history of architecture. Just this relationship, this kind of full kind of exploration of geometry, the rigor of that geometry, of this grid of cylindrical bends, but also how that becomes sort of recursive in scale, where you get the nesting of these smaller cylinders, these secondary bends and tertiary bends in between in the kind of leftover spaces, but then how all of that steel frame, which you see in solid black, right? All of that steel frame, how that also exists through the building as the primary system of support, and then ties all of these bends together to work together as basically one giant field of columns, enormous columns. And there you see just hatched in around the perimeter that brick curtain wall that surrounds the building. And also then the beauty of, I think, this negotiation in between the geometry of the circle and these embedded circles held within this really clear rectilinear and linear system of organization. In total, there are 30 primary bends in the building. Those are the largest circles you see here. Those have a 38-foot diameter. They're 70 feet in height. In between those are 18 secondary interstitial bends with a 15-foot-6 diameter, plus another 18 exterior small bends of 9-foot 9-inch diameter for a total of 66 bends, plus perimeter loading tanks for a combined capacity of 3 million bushels. And with the use of its 3 marine towers, actually today only 2 exist, it was capable of elevating 60,000 bushels per hour. And just again, for context, DART's original elevator raised a very proud 1,000 bushels of grain per hour. So this was 60 times more efficient in terms of its loading and unloading capacity in a given hour. And on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1897, the building made the cover of Scientific American. And this article is fascinating to read today. I think it makes so much of all of this building's great innovations. It also includes the fact that the building had the largest conveyor belts in the world. It had a double system of dust collectors, both upstairs and down, which was an entirely new and never before used method and scale of dust collection. Also, again, for the benefit of fireproofing. It featured brushless motors with no sliding electrical contacts to ensure absolute sparkless running. And all of this was electrically powered, of course, by Niagara Falls, which was also a kind of amazing, again, tie to this only being possible in some respects in the context of Western New York. In fact, I love this Sanborn insurance map from 1899, just 2 years after the building's completion. And here at the bottom is the Great Northern Elevator. And note that this is a fire insurance map. And so here, the purpose of this map, at least in part, is to then, show all of the buildings in the city and also reveal their construction types and code those. And so insurers could also know and understand the construction types as also a means of, insuring the building and understanding the risks of any fire for any given building. And so, so it's color coded based on construction types. Yellow represents wood construction. Pink is used for masonry, gray for iron, and so forth. But the Great Northern is brown. And what brown means is, frankly, doesn't matter what it's made of, it's fireproof. So, and that's pretty much what the key says. The key just shows the color brown alongside all the other colors, and it just says next to it, fireproof building. So no material or construction method revealed, just we assure you it's fireproof, which is pretty amazing. Here's just a zoom in of the Great Northern and its 3 marine towers on the City Ship Canal in the Sanborn map. And here's an article from Engineering News in 1901. And this was an article called Fireproof Grain Elevators in America. You can see it starts down there on the kind of lower bottom left. And it was by John Kennedy of the American Society of Civil Engineering. And they discuss in this article, it's probably no surprise that they discuss the Great Northern specifically at length. And it compares construction costs and insurance costs between wooden and fireproof grain elevators, and using the Great Northern as an example in this. And I think what's also really interesting here is the implication that this had not only on the owners of these buildings, but also on those people that owned the grain. These were not always the same. Because you'd not only insure the buildings, right? but you also had to separately insure the grain, the commodity itself, right? And the insurance rate for grain being stored was tied to the facilities in which one was using for the storage of that grain. In fact, here in Scientific American, what's amazing in this article, I'm sorry, here in Engineering News, as also in Scientific American, the position was that actually insurance for these buildings and the grain being stored in these buildings, like the Great Northern, was not even needed. Yes, it might be necessary for other reasons, just in terms of kind of legalities and contracts and so forth. But frankly, insurance in these buildings isn't even needed, and neither for the grain stored within it. And so, and as part of this, then that really significantly cut the insurance costs for storing in fireproof grain elevators, such as the Great Northern, as a kind of exemplar of this new building technology. And so, in fact, actually, insurance costs came in at a savings of about 80% to the grain shippers. So amazing cost reduction that is implemented through the Great Northern and buildings like it. And so now by the end of the 19th century, we have annual receipts in grain coming up to 128 million bushels. And then 1898, now 221 million bushels. So that the decade of the Great Northern is an amazingly productive decade in this time period. You see also much more so than 1862 to 91, when we now are advancing in these new fireproof construction systems. What I also love about the Great Northern and the way it's represented here on the cover of Scientific American is that they are really emphasizing the construction system of this steel frame and the steel bends that are in its interior and otherwise not visible from the exterior. And in fact, it also reveals the true nature of the brick, and that actually you actually see in the back that the roof, the entire roof and the head house, which there are other later photos that show the entire construction completed of the bends and the roof construction, roof assembly, before the brick is actually risen up and completed the enclosure of the building. And so it is completely, an entirely fact that the building, even with its enormous hole in its north facade, is at absolutely zero risk of falling down, of collapsing, or some larger structural failure due to that hole in the brick. Because in fact, the building was built without that brick wall at all, with all of its roof and head house on the top of the building. And we see this really clearly revealed in the cover of this article. But what's also amazing in these two photographs is that we see the Great Northern as this kind of hinge between these two periods, because on the top we see the completed building, which really kind of frankly takes the form, the overall form and massing of its wooden forebears that we see in the Bennett elevator, which is actually the elevator that took the place, that was built on top of the site of Joseph Dart's original elevator after it had been destroyed by fire. And so this looks a lot like, the Bennett elevator of 1863. We see the echoes of that form very clearly in the Great Northern in its exterior. But in the image of its silo construction on the interior, these cylindrical forms, which were much better for storing grain and for the movement of grain doesn't get stuck in corners and so forth. This kind of optimal form we even saw used in antiquity, right? In Crete, the cylinder was used for similar reasons, right? But on the that this form on the inside, and also this increasingly kind of elongated linear organization and bend logic in terms of geometry really looks so much more like the concrete grain elevators that we know are to come just a few years later, and what we are now so familiar with today that almost entirely comprise these buildings on our waterfront. And so, and of course, the concrete building types through the advancement of slip form construction. And so, we see sort of the birth of this image of the concrete grain elevator really, and also then the kind of sort of pulling forward of the wooden construction and that kind of merging of these two typologies as really emblematic in the Great Northern. And in really no other building, I think, in the entire world do we see these kind of two eras of grain elevator construction come together so clearly, and I think so beautifully at that. Of course, Concrete Central is then the kind of biggest and largest, most impressive at the other end of this construction, the story of construction typology, being nearly 1/4 of a mile long, also the largest grain elevator in the world at its time of construction, storing a total capacity of 4.5 million bushels, equal to then 82 of Joseph Dart's original grain elevators from 1842, kind of incredible. And so now we've firmly really entered, after 1900, we've entered this concrete era. And so of the grain elevators we're familiar with today. And by the 1930s, we then reach the peak of grain handling in Buffalo, processing around 300 million bushels annually. But it's also at this time that Buffalo becomes the nation's largest flour producer. And this kind of transitions into us into a story of all of the other sort of benefits and industries that benefited in Buffalo and also kind of boosted Buffalo in its position around the transshipment of grain. And so, of course, one, with flour production, of course, when you have grain, you're going to then, you've got grain sitting around, you're going to use it. But it's not just that, it's actually some really interesting things related to that. And in 1932, a woman named Laura O'Day visited Buffalo, and she wrote this article in the journal Economic Geography, and it was titled Buffalo as a Flour Milling Center. And it has it's a very interesting article and includes a lot of interesting figures and research. Here, what we see also, the map of the extent of wheat acreage in the United States and Canada in 1919, 1920. And of course, you see so much of that in the Midwest and Great Plains, and then up, extending through the upper Midwest and into several provinces in Canada. And in fact, 75.1%, so 75% of grain moved in 1930 was wheat. And so wheat was by far the dominant grain in terms of transshipment. This map is from 1923, and actually Laura O'Day includes a kind of update in 1930 to this map in her article. And what's amazing is that here's where we see the kind of bulk of grain moving across the Great Lakes system, and actually coming from the western end of the Great Lakes, from places like Port Arthur and Fort William, up in Ontario, and also Duluth and Superior in Minnesota and Wisconsin, all moving then eastward, and also collecting more grain, of course, even from Chicago, Milwaukee, et cetera, as we then move through the system and to Buffalo. But I think what's incredible is that you see that so much of that really ends in Buffalo. Of course, we know because it then becomes exported and distributed through other means of transportation. This is actually just representing, of course, water, movement by water. But what's so amazing about this is because we're collecting all of that grain from all of these different places, what became clear is that if you are a flour miller, it is much better to locate in Buffalo than it is Minneapolis, the previous leading flour producer, because in Buffalo, you have your selection of all of the top grain, right? You have all of the grain coming to Buffalo effectively. And so that means you can select from that the best of the very best grain. And so we really see this kind of shift in flour production and at a large scale take hold in Buffalo, because you've got really the kind of cream of the crop, if you will, in terms of all the best grain arriving, kind of descending on Buffalo. And at this time, then, the grain storage capacity of Buffalo is more than 3 times that of any other port on the lower lakes or on the St. Lawrence River. We had 39 grain elevators at this time with a capacity of over 47 million bushels. And so this means Buffalo took this position as the bulk breaking point in the grain trade of North America. But through this, it also, what's revealed in this is that we do have these kind of sister cities, if you will, especially that of Duluth and Superior and those ports, and also of Thunder Bay, Ontario, formerly Port Arthur and Fort William. And there's just some, populations and statistics there as reference here. And of course, it's, Minneapolis that had actually experimented with concrete construction methods that kind of give us the modern grain elevator too, as we know it. So our story, we have this kind of sister city of Minneapolis as well in terms of this larger story of the development of the typology of grain elevator as a building. And so, here we've got that larger network. But we also then, not only flour, we have these other interesting kind of side stories. So Buffalo, because Buffalo was the terminus of grain movement on the Great Lakes, constituting 76% of all North American grain movement in the 1920s, we know that Buffalo millers had the best quality grains. And so now we see this emergence as flour producer, but also a byproduct of flour milling actually it constitutes 30% of every bushel of wheat milled, is for the production of feed. And so feed was also a significant byproduct. And because Buffalo is where it is in relation to the dairy belt, the American dairy belt of New England, New York, and Pennsylvania, it also meant that milling flour in Buffalo was advantageous for the byproduct of feed that also had a direct market. But I think another thing that's super interesting, and I think people don't, maybe a lot of people don't realize, is that Buffalo also offered the lucrative prospect of returning west with a full load of cargo. Maybe that's more obvious in the form of package freight, but also in anthracite coal from Pennsylvania. And in fact, in 1928, 53% of all anthracite coal shipped from Pennsylvania was shipped to Buffalo, ranking Buffalo as the leading export center for anthracite coal. And so coal becomes part of our story in a way that's only possible because of the transshipment of grain. And so this really spawned this entire landscape and fueled this, all of these kind of other kind of legs of industries here in the city and cemented our significance. This is Duluth Superior. And I think though, and so here's an image, it's actually sort of much like our outer harbor in some ways, where you get these sort of piers with grain elevators constructed linearly along them. But what's so interesting when we broaden our view to think about this larger context of grain being loaded in Duluth Superior and moving from there across the Great Lakes to Buffalo, it also meant that companies, including Great Northern, often had operations strategically in both cities. So in fact, what you might not know is there's another Great Northern. There's another Great Northern, which is the Great Northern Grain Elevator S, located in Superior, Wisconsin, built in 1901, just after our Great Northern here in Buffalo. And it looks remarkably similar, though the construction method is different. In fact, and this building still exists today. It's actually still operational today. And so while the appearances suggest they're remarkably similar, they're in fact actually quite different in overall kind of bin organization and also exterior cladding. The Great Northern S on the screen is a building constructed of iron, but and so there's this kind of steel structure, but it contains a rectangular system of grain bins inside this metal clad shell. So it is not the cylindrical bins that make, like the Great Northern here in Buffalo, that make it so interesting in terms of this hinge example between these two eras of grain elevator construction. But what's also interesting is because it's metal clad with its curtain wall, unlike our brick clad Great Northern, it also is more readily understood as a non-structural, non-load bearing exterior wall construction, which, you know, at Buffalo, this has been such a big point of contention and misunderstanding. And actually, frankly, this campaign of disinformation waged by ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, who owns the building, that really kind of untruthfully describe its brick wall as playing a structural role in the building's construction. And so, so here is a more direct analogy to show, actually, this is a building constructed in some way similarly to the Great Northern, and we see it's not load-bearing brick, but its exterior wall acts the same. One thing that's just an interesting aside that I learned about this is that you see here the ship that is being loaded from the Great Northern. You know, you'll notice that there are no marine towers left on the Great Northern S. And at first I thought, well, this is probably a product of the fact that technology has changed. And so we no longer use the same conveyor system that we did when the marine towers were constructed, and like what we have here in Buffalo. But in fact, it's actually that this building never had marine towers. And the reason is because this is a starting point for grain to move across the Great Lakes. You would always be loading ships, and never are you unloading ships, which is really interesting. So you're never unloading, you're only ever loading, which means there's really no point to the marine towers that would raise the grain all the way to the head house from ship. So instead, grain was being loaded into the silos, not from water, but from rail primarily by this time. So really interesting, just slight difference. And there, of course, you see that our Great Northern with its two marine towers originally had three. But now we've got these two buildings that really are kind of speaking to each other, communicating across the system of Great Lakes as these two sister Great Northern buildings. I do think it's interesting that if we look at places like Thunder Bay and Duluth Superior, that the way in which their grain elevator, this collection of grain elevators, which actually is about the same number of extant grain elevator complexes as we have here in Buffalo, but they're organized very differently. They're organized, like I said, in this kind of tiered system of linear silos along a kind of outer waterfront. That makes it very different than the way these buildings are constructed in Buffalo. This is a map produced in 1939 of all of the Buffalo waterfront, showing the locations of grain elevators and larger industries of Buffalo. And what you see, of course, is this really interesting. Of course, we have a very similar condition on the outer harbor for grain elevators, but by far the vast majority of our silo complexes are oriented along the Buffalo River. And what that makes for is this incredibly irregular and frankly, kind of picturesque, something that sort of taps into a more romantic concept of landscape, of this picturesque landscape, as these buildings more irregularly align and relate to the snaking of the Buffalo River. And you get all of these interesting and irregular kind of spaces in between, these very urban spaces in between. Of course, now we know and are familiar with spaces like that at Silo City that really frame the silos in very unique ways. That break from that rigid orthogonality that we see elsewhere. So another kind of, I think, really beautiful aspect of their orientation here in Buffalo. But nonetheless, we have these buildings both related to water and then also rail. And so you have these kind of two fronts to them in terms of the system of loading and unloading. But I want to shift gears a little bit now that we've kind of laid out a history of innovation here as we move into sort of this second part of the talk, where we talk about the relationship of these buildings to then the development of modernism as an idea, as an architectural movement. And here we see sort of what's often considered the poster child, of buildings of modernism, Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, completed in 1931 in Poissy, outside of Paris, France. And so in this building, we can already even recognize pretty clearly some of the inspiration that had happened by this time in terms of the landscape of grain elevators and also their sister buildings, the daylight factories, and all of the adoration and careful study of those buildings by European architects in the period of especially the 19-teens and 1920s. And so we recognize that these buildings were not just admired for all of the reasons we've already laid out and that are made really clear in Scientific American and Engineering News as marvels of industry and engineering and innovation, but also as effectively great monuments of architecture, moving them from the field of engineering to architecture, kind of recontextualizing them as works of architecture that, along with daylight factories, went on to inspire this generation of architects, first in Europe, but ultimately across the world. And Buffalo specifically is a big part of that story. And what you see here, if you're looking at this facade, it is this combination of this more rigid gridded space with its long window that you can argue really kind of has its finds its inspiration in the rigid gridded orthogonal geometries and organizational structures of daylight factories. What we see on the roof is something quite different. We see something that is much more sculptural, much more animated in its form through these cylindrical forms that are caught in light, bathed in light, and you see how the kind of light moves from light to shadow and renders that form in a rather kind of profound way, that these more sculptural forms really tap into the kind of profound kind of monumentality and sculpturality of the grain elevators themselves. Walter Gropius is one of the early and most famous architects to have included grain elevators and also grain elevators in Buffalo, New York. There you see one of the slides pulled out labeled Elevator Buffalo in first a lecture in 1911 with a series of slides, but later a paper that he published in which we see this interest start to take shape in inspiration through these works of engineering. So there we see Buffalo kind of literally intersecting these European modern architects. In fact, Walter Gropius had worked in this realm of industrial architecture. And so he had worked previously for Peter Behrens at a time when this building, the AEG turbine factory, was also being constructed. And so he had practiced designing factories and industrial buildings in Berlin, in Germany. In fact, also Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe also worked for barons in their formative years. And so we actually have this confluence of finding inspiration in industrial architecture through their own practices and the kind of young formation of their careers in Berlin. And this is an early project of Walter Gropius, the Fageswerk, which is a factory complex in Alfeld in Germany. And so this is a factory architect in 1911, 1913, as he's publishing these images of factories, daylight factories and grain elevators in Buffalo. And this is the architect that goes on to design the Bauhaus. Again, one of these buildings that is so iconic and canonic in terms of its position in advancing an architectural language and concept related to what we refer to as, of course, modernism, and in its home in Dessau, Berlin. But also then, so this goes on into this this paper in 1913 that's published, and here we see that same elevator that we see actually a series of elevators, but including also elevators in Buffalo that are published as part of this series. And there's that slide. This is from the slide of the last from the lecture. And the assertion really here with this whole series of images that really front loaded the text is that actually it was the US and North America that was really the industrial motherland, not Germany, which was a really bold proposition to a German audience in 1911 and 1913. And so they were really kind of shifting geographies here and talking about where in the world we are seeing the greatest advancements, of course, in engineering, but also as powerful, undeniably powerful works, these kind of buildings that really operate as machines, the scale of cathedrals, cathedrals to industry in the Americas. And it's Le Corbusier in 1923, in his seminal publication, this book Towards a New Architecture, which was later translated into English in 1927, where we see Corbusier also including a chapter on grain elevators and on daylight factories. And it's interesting to note that Corbusier, for the sake of argument, you'll see he's taking the slides from Gropius, including this one here, where in Buenos Aires, where he's actually even editing, before Photoshop, of course, editing the grain elevator to remove these little, what could be read as more historicized details, almost like little pediments or gables. He's actually clipping them off, cutting them out of the photograph for the sake of clarity of argument, to really talk about these buildings as pure expressions, absolutely pure expressions, even maybe somewhat in a misleading way, but as pure expressions of this notion of form following so directly the notion of function in building design and concept. And here we see also the Dakota elevator here in Buffalo included in the text of Towards a New Architecture. So kind of amazing. But it's in this text that Corbusier says, there is one profession and one only, namely architecture, in which progress is not considered necessary, where laziness is enthroned, and in which the reference is always to yesterday. And he goes on, thus we have the American grain elevators and factories, the magnificent first fruits of a new age. The American engineers overwhelm with their calculations our expiring architecture, meaning Europe's expiring architecture. So these are a couple, heavy-hitting statements, compounded also by Gropius in a European context. But it's also important to note that they're not admiring American architecture, right? They're admiring American engineering as inspiration to architecture. Walter Gropius goes on to publish this book called International Architecture in 1925. And what's really interesting about this publication is you actually see in this table of contents all of these examples of, by 25, what we would label as modern architecture. But what's fascinating is he pairs these still with intermixed examples of grain elevators side by side. In fact, this spread, our favorite spread in this book, right, includes Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building here in Buffalo, New York, next to a grain elevator. This grain elevator not in Buffalo, but in Minneapolis, but nonetheless really cementing this, our position in Buffalo, but also the legacy, of these grain elevators in terms of their position as part of the modern canon, as part of the canon of buildings that so clearly define modernism in architecture as the kind of birth of this idea. And so here's another spread of unbuilt buildings. So not only even just built buildings, but here's unbuilt proposals. And then next, so we have here pages 50 and 51, the next spread, 52, 53 being of 2 grain elevator complexes. So the juxtaposition of these projects alongside grain elevators also really evidences that influence. Eric Mendelsohn was the only of these architects to actually visit Buffalo, but these actually sketches are from before he visited Buffalo. It was 1924 where he came to Buffalo and wrote just these incredible feverish letters home, really just so poetically describing his encounters with these buildings, these grain elevators, and also just all of the kind of movement of industry around the Buffalo Harbor. Beautiful letters. But ultimately publishes this book the next year, 1925, America, which includes some of his photographs that he took in the US, but also specifically here in Buffalo. There's 2 slides from Buffalo, his own photographs. And Bruno Taut published this book, Modern Architecture, in 1929. And so you can see through all of these publications, and in fact, Modern Architecture included a slide of Concrete Central from Buffalo by this time. So you have all of this really reinforcing Buffalo's position in the story of modernism as per the theme of this series. Also, we have this amazing kind of intersection with Buffalo that in 1940, we have this exhibition at the Albright Knox Art Gallery called Buffalo Architecture 1816 to 1940. And this was organized by Henry Russell Hitchcock in cooperation with Gordon Washburn. And just to mention, Henry Russell Hitchcock played an important role also in cementing modernism because he was, in partnership with Philip Johnson, responsible for this book from 1932, labeling modernism the international style, architecture since 1922, which doesn't feature grain elevators, but nonetheless, is a building that cements this kind of broader internationality of this practice of modern architecture. But it's Henry Russell Hitchcock that cites Buffalo, and this is the quote, he says, among all the splendid 20th century elevators in Buffalo, this is a photograph included in that exhibition of what's now the Cargill Pool Elevator, what was then Saskatchewan Pool Elevator, completed in 1925. He says, among all the splendid 20th century elevators in Buffalo, this is the finest, both because of its isolated site and its intrinsic excellence. And goes on to say that such utilitarian structures set an architectural standard for this century which few architects in more conventional buildings have ever approached. And so while this isn't the Great Northern, again, just to talk about the broader, what the Great Northern is so indelibly a part of, that is of such great significance internationally in terms of developments in architecture. And Rainer Banham then comes here in 1976, 1980 to 1980 to teach at the University of Buffalo in the School of Architecture and Planning. And out of that publishes A Concrete Atlantis, US Industrial Building and European Modern Architecture. And this is a really interesting publication, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but where he actually is taking the opportunity in his 4 years in Buffalo to actually revisit in person all of these sites of Buffalo's grain elevators and daylight factories to sort of follow in the footsteps, if you will, of modernists, sort of recapture photographs and images in the same places those photographs had been taken in the 19-teens and 20s and so forth, but also sort of discover all of the sort of strange and more eccentric details that the modernists tended to overlook. Remember Corbusier kind of cutting out, photoshopping out all of those little gables or pediments in his slides. And so he's also revealing that maybe the narrative of these buildings is more complex and thus also more interesting than that kind of purely ideological sort of take by the modernist architects in the teens and 20s. But nonetheless, we see through the 20th century so much direct inspiration. And this is my favorite building of that period of early modernism, kind of high modernism, really, the Werkbundsiedlung housing by French architect, André Lersat, where you see in Vienna, and actually if you could just take like 5 steps to the left, what you actually get is these stair towers. These are the stair towers for the housing. They form this kind of continuous line of cylinders of silos, right? So the series of white silos looks exactly like a grain elevator like the Washburn Crosby or American here in Buffalo. It's an interesting building because here you've got those stair towers that give access to the units or the various floors of the units. On the backside, we have a very different building. In fact, the backside can be read as taking its cues from Daylight Factory. And so it's almost as if these two typologies have really literally sort of merged together, on one side Daylight Factory, on the other side grain elevator, to really put an image of modern architecture to, or an image of the influence of grain elevators and Daylight Factories to modern architecture. But all through, we can zoom way forward, but all through then the history of the 20th century, we see these references pervade. And also not even just in architecture, but also in American art. Here, this fabulous depiction of, you can see this kind of multi-view and collapsed kind of layering of all of these views of silos in Minneapolis. Here in a title, Granaries to Babylon. Again, the associations as if these are monuments that have a kind of ancient power and resonance to them in terms of scale. Here, Ralston Crawford, who was here in Buffalo and painting also Buffalo's grain elevators. And these amazing collections of photographs that document grain elevators all over the world by Bernd and Hille Bescher, including there at the center, H.O. Oates, which has unfortunately been demolished. And so this industrial history is our cultural history, you know, and it is also tremendously important then, I think, though, because of the kind of relationship between industrial history and cultural history here, to then also tie this to the significance these buildings hold for generations of grain millers from Buffalo and beyond. And this is why also members of the bakery, confectionery, tobacco workers, and grain millers Local 36G announced their interest in determining the feasibility for purchasing the Great Northern and repurposing it as a union hall or a public museum space, for example, and saving this building. In fact, in their announcement, they also they recorded us saying, "This is our history." And further, this organization directly represents the workers at ADM. And so, you know, so we have this story here, just as we kind of conclude with this, and then I'll just end with a couple of examples of other projects that have taken these sites and transformed them in rather profound ways. But we have this entire narrative, this entire story that cuts through this entire cross-section of significance at so many different scales, from the local to the global. And so it's the sum total of all of this that not just, you know, makes the grain elevator a tremendously special and unique contribution to the history of the world of modernism, but also Buffalo, one of the most important cities in the world for this collection, for this large extant collection, compounded by the fact that the story of the grain elevator is so firmly rooted here with its birth in 1842. And the Great Northern as the oldest surviving example and only of its type, and one of true absolute innovation for its time. Not to mention its just undeniable monumental power in its form, scale, material expression, and for its site on the City of Ship Canal. In 1990 to 91, the Historic American Engineering Record, which is a federal record established by the National Park Service, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the Library of Congress, produced a detailed report on the Great Northern and 19 other Buffalo grain elevators. And they said at that time, quote, "The grain elevators of Buffalo comprise the most outstanding collection of extant grain elevators in the United States and collectively represent the variety of construction materials, building forms, and technological innovations that revolutionized the handling of grain in this country." And together, this report represents hundreds of pages of historical documentation on the significance of these elevators, and the Great Northern plays a very central and starting role in this package of materials. And so much attention is paid to the Great Northern specifically. But what I think what's important to note as we kind of then shift and talk about the preservation and impending demolition of this building is that through this, what we see is this amazing documentation. But actually, if we start to look at all of these grain elevators as documented by the Hare Report, what's really disappointing is that we've already lost more than 25% of these elevators since the report was written in 1990, 1991. And so I think this is a really startling statistic because this is like core to preservation is that, especially in a city like Buffalo, where we have so many of these buildings, it's so easy to sort of be dismissive of the demolition of any one, because we can always say, yeah, it's just one, we've got so many, if we lose one, so be it. We have so many amazing examples. But certainly in the case of Great Northern, we do just have one in terms of its uniqueness. But when you start to add up all of these one by one demolitions, we've now already lost and destroyed ourselves, as the city of Buffalo, more than a quarter of our collection. And in fact, we're reaching more than almost a third with the demolition of the Great Northern. And so we're eating away at this bit by bit in a way that is fundamentally kind of sacrificing the profound power and significance of this as a collection in the city of Buffalo. I think what's important too is, in terms of the misinformation that's been spread about this building, by ADM specifically, is that the windstorm on December 11th, 2021, that they were, of course, positioning this building as if it's in jeopardy because of that event. And in fact, actually, if in case you didn't know, this is something that's happened before in the history of the Great Northern specifically. And so on January 20th, 1907, a very similar wind event and storm blew a hole that looks remarkably similar to the hole we're familiar with today in actually the south wall of the Great Northern. So this is the opposite end wall, not the same wall. And what's really fascinating is looking at, and I dug through newspaper archives of the Buffalo Courier. And so this is the newspaper article from the next day after that storm in the Buffalo Courier, in which they specifically talk about the damage to the Great Northern, at this time referred to and called the Mutual Transportation Company elevator. And specifically this damage of the Great Northern in 1907, you just saw the photograph, was cited as, quote, not heavy damage. And in fact, and here's the two images side by side, and in fact, we know that this hole in the south facade was then repaired immediately upon that, and the building has existed for another more than 100 years since this event. And so all of this is really this kind of campaign of misinformation that was really propelling this idea that this building was too far gone to be saved, which is frankly this kind of trope of kind of anti-preservation trope that in this case we have demonstrable example of the fact that that is simply untrue. But I think, it's important in the context of that Hare report that we do discuss the Great Northern in this context of this larger collection of grain elevators and its significance in the city. And thus also the potential weight of all of this landscape that actually stretches all down our waterfront from the Niagara River to Lake Erie and along the Buffalo River, all the way down to the sites of Bethlehem Republic Steel and so forth, that we have this larger industrial landscape that really has this potential, I think, to be listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And certainly, I would argue, meets eligibility on at least 3 criteria. One, that the Great Northern and its companion structures exhibit an important interchange of human values over a span of time and within a cultural area of the world on developments in architecture and technology. 2, that the Great Northern and its companion structures bear a unique and exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition central to a modern and global civilization. Both really important pieces of the story. And 3, that the Great Northern in particular, but also alongside its companion structures, is an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural and technological ensemble. And I think it's important there that for UNESCO, that's an or. So it's either a type of building or an architectural or a technological ensemble. For us, that's all and in this case. And landscape, which illustrates a significant stage in human history, which this very clearly does. And so I think we're talking about this broader significance. We talk a lot about what it means to be locally listed, which is incredibly important. I can't say enough for local landmark listing. But what we're really talking about is something of global and international significance. And lastly, I'm not going to talk to each one of these projects, but it is also a kind of misnomer that these buildings are impossible to reuse. And so they are very specific buildings, but there are so many interesting cases as close as Akron, Ohio, where we see grain elevators transformed into something else and adaptively repurposed. And so if there is not an industrial future for these buildings, there is absolutely the possibility of a newly kind of realized future potential. This is a great building that takes these silos and instead hangs apartment units on the outside of the silo, which still frees the space of its interior. This project is a silo in Copenhagen, a city that actually has retrofitted a lot of different silo complexes into also housing as it remakes its formerly industrial harbor and waterfront into new neighborhoods for the city, much like what is happening in parts of our waterfront and sites of public space. This project here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, was a project that was also too far gone, where you see this mill that was destroyed by fire that has since been preserved as a ruin of itself. Again, you know, potentials when we think of the Great Northern, and a really powerful building also for it in its ruinous state that has become a center of education, understanding the context of Minneapolis. This is one of my favorite examples in Germany, an entire coal mine industrial complex, UNESCO listed, that has been entirely reconfigured as a site for culture, museums, mixed use programming, institutions, and also an enormous public landscape. These are some photos of in the interior of the coal washing plant, where you now have museum exhibits that talk about this industrial history in a region that's really analogous to Buffalo in many ways in Germany, and really kind of transforming these into really beautiful and profound spaces of education and civic spaces. And here also it's landscape, which kind of moves in and around all of these industrial buildings as a new public civic amenity and park space for the people of Essen. And here a museum that more recently completed in 2021 in Duisburg, Germany, really nearby the others, where again, some of these really powerful spaces, in this case also riveted boilerplate steel silos that now are occupied as spaces within this museum that you move through. Again, kind of revealing these industrial spaces. Here also in France, where this is not a grain elevator, but an old boat warehouse, in which case an addition, a kind of sister addition, has been added that contains new modern programs that allows the kind of power of the scale and even emptiness of that vast original building to be maintained. And so a clever response to the preservation of that building by adding to it a kind of twin that contains its modern exhibition labs and archives programs. And more recently, actually, here's an archive building that inserts this brick volume into this other historic building for the purpose of an archive. So there's also interesting things that are sort of happy to be in these types of spaces. This is not a grain elevator, but nonetheless, this kind of vast windowless building. And in 2011, Thomas Heatherwick's renovation of this silo complex in Cape Town, South Africa, which also really creatively reinterpreted some of its spaces and actually cut into, sort of voided, so this sort of subtraction of some of the silos, where he sort of differenced out this volume, so you actually get this larger sense of the geometry of the spaces and sort of carve out larger, more usable spaces for these various other programs. So there are so many ways to adaptively repurpose these buildings, and actually these projects were also projects that met in different capacities, also met a lot of disbelief in the idea that there was a viable future for these buildings and also some of the regions that they're existed in, but instead, you know, have breathed new life while also maintaining the history and legacy of these places. So with that, I know I'm over time, so I apologize, but I'll conclude there. And thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and and we'll see what was left to come. So thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Greg. Like quite literally lovely, and so much information. And on a silly note, I've been flirting with the idea of getting tattoos for all the different places that I've lived. And oh my God, a tattoo of the floor plan of the Great Northern or the Mendelssohn's drawings of the grain elevators. Like those are two great tattoos.
That would be awesome. I agree.
Anyway.
I can see it. I love it.
For real. I have a couple of questions I do want to ask you, but somebody did post one so far. So again, while we're answering these questions and talking, and hopefully you turning your light back on because you've
Yes,
disappeared into the darkness. But the question that we had posed from one of the audience members is that you mentioned that the possible repurposing of the Great Northern, what may have been the reasons the idea or momentum fizzled? And I will just take a stab at answering that first before I pass it on to Greg. And you know, this is a part PBN answer and certainly my own personal opinion about this. I don't think that we can even say that questions about the reuse of Great Northern fizzled because I don't think that it was even allowed to spark. I think that the union, PBN, a couple of other individuals came forward with very viable options to start discussions and explore, and ADM is not interested in that. They have no interest in keeping this building. They want a parking lot. They are not interested in leaving it there and sharing that space for whatever their business and insurance or whatever reasons. They are not interested in any way to save this building and give it to somebody else. They want that land. They want access to those railroads. They don't want anyone else on their property. So it's not even a question of fizzling. It was not even allowed to start. Greg, any other?
Which I would just remind everyone, I think on the one hand, of course, it is their property, but it's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate position to take, both because it lacks any community engagement and interest, which is actually a tenet of their Fortune 500 company, and have actually been cited as a great example for community engagement, which I would question after this, after this experience here in Buffalo. But nonetheless, it's not a building that they are using. So it's not as though this is a building that they've been using and still, it's that it has been unused. It has been entirely neglected for the decades of its ownership. They purchased the building knowing it was a locally listed landmark, and presumably then, of course, the laws attached to that and the responsibility of stewardship that comes with owning a locally listed landmark that they entered into willfully and by choice. And so what I think is really thinly veiled, if at all, is that and we know from their own history that they have tried to demolish this building several times. And so this was clearly an opportune moment that this happened to then sort of say, again, falsely, that this building will collapse if we don't tear it down. It must, be issued. We must issue an emergency demolition permit for that, which they were granted, and thus, like Christy said, was just never entertained even the question of the possibility of its adaptive reuse, which is really unfortunate when we have so many people that have been that with money, people that can also put money where their mouth is, like Douglas Jamal and so forth, that have expressed real interest in the future of this building and the development and even taking that on. So it's very disheartening, to say the least.
1000%. So on Monday, we had Liz Waitakis from Docomomo, which, for those who aren't aware, is our national organization that focuses on the preservation and documentation of modern architecture. And they pick a theme every year for their organization to focus on. Last year, their theme was the 70s turn 50, or previous year was the 70s turn 50. And this year's theme is malls. And so I thought that was a really interesting conversation with her about the idea of, I know that we all understand the idea of preservation and saving those pretty buildings and the buildings where famous, important things happened. But something that we on the inside always talk about is that what we do is actually about saving typologies and saving examples of particular styles and massing, types of buildings. So when it comes from your position, your point of view, that question of saving a typology that is obsolete. How do we, you just explained very wonderfully why this typology is important. But how maybe you can just speak on that more, that question of the insanity to some people that we want to save something that is obsolete.
Yeah, well, I think that's what I love about my profession, which is architecture. And of course, I'm biased at that, but I think because what is so fun about architecture is that you can't, in some ways, know the potential of something without at least asking that as a question and then testing that through design, right? And so there are so many examples, and I had to kind of fly through those at the end just because I knew I was over time, and everyone was bearing with me. But those are all examples that took buildings that were also frankly quoted as eyesores. You hear this all the time, it's an eyesore. Just because anything for that matter, is an eyesore today, doesn't mean that is its only option as a future. And it is through, the creativity of design that one can envision really productive futures for what sometimes are really challenging sites. I think this, it's how I also look at, the unfortunate demolition of the majority of Paul Rudolph shoreline apartments. Speaking of our collection of modern architecture in Western New York, which is at this kind of turning point, these questions, where these buildings are often, buildings that have not, in that case, of course, something that has suffered from decades of neglect and underinvestment and active disinvestment, which is, of course, tied to also the people that lived in those spaces and our values societally, at least as expressed through lack of investment and so forth. But that site, it's not as though architecture and in its original state was always perfect, right? But again, there's so much potential there where I could have imagined a kind of recasting of Paul Rudolph Shoreline Apartments with a new kind of master plan and landscape, a vision of landscape and potential also infill that not only renovated and transformed the units for the 21st century in all kinds of ways, but also could recast the site and sort of see new potentials in it, even for some of its more challenging aspects. And so it's always, I think it's at least worth testing, worth asking these questions and testing them. And so that, and I think that's what, if anything, I think my discipline in architecture, but also in preservation, what we could do a better job at collectively is also trying to offer back visions. And here I'm giving examples, but also kind of visions for even just the potentials of these sites so people can see beyond the eyesore. I think it's so hard for a lot of members of the public, and that's not everyone, of course. There's so many people that see this potential here, but for so many members of the public to actually see, it's just hard to see potential in something that is in such a state of disrepair as something worth investing in. And the complex in Minneapolis is a great example, again, of something that was too far gone to the nth degree from what we have in the Great Northern, but now is one of kind of the major sites of education and tourism in the city of Minneapolis as a site to tell its story, and especially as it relates to ours in this case. So really,
no, for sure. I know we're over time, but I do have one more question that I do actually want to ask you. So when I ask you that, a brief on that one, but I do just want to mention the comment that was made that ADM is bad enough. What about the complicity of City Hall and the courts? And I certainly agree with that. There is nothing stopping City Hall from rescinding that emergency demolition. I think that we all, toddlers could understand that a building standing 9-10 months after the catastrophic event is no longer needing an emergency demolition. So definitely agree with that statement. And my last question, brief answer for me.
Yeah, sorry.
No, just because I want to respect everyone's time. So what you were just discussing about how, yes, we as a field need to do better about educating the public and working with those to see that vision and to buy into that. But I think that, what's holding, some of those projects that you went through in Europe are amazing projects. And I feel like we'll never get to having those amazing projects, not even because we don't have the money or the vision, but it's the art, the design isn't there. Mm-hmm. So how do we work on helping and supporting our architects so that they are making these amazing ideas so that we can make these crazy visionary projects happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And of course, there's no answer to that. And I will just say, of course, commend PBN, because in this mission to educate and engage the public in a way that's what you are doing. So thank you for that. And I think, but ultimately there's a larger, it's the responsibility of more people than just organizations like PBN, including, my role and others like me. But I think, one challenging thing with architecture and design is that you benefit from experience. And so when we don't have a lot of experience investing in sites like these, which tends to be the case in the US, and especially, in challenging cases of preservation and challenging cases of also kind of adaptive reuse and so forth. And there are a bunch of great examples. But when in Buffalo, for example, we don't have those kind of grain elevators that have been transformed into something else. It also means there's not the same development of skill in understanding those projects on the side of architecture, right? So with experimentation and with experience retrofitting these sites come design innovation and skill. And so, it's likely that first projects, might not be the star project in terms of adaptive reuse of some of these more challenging sites, but we have a lot of these sites, a lot of these questions for the city. And so that means we also can build a kind of design wherewithal around it. But at the same time, I think what's unique about our position now is that we have decades of lessons to learn from other cities and places. And so you have those case studies that can kind of backfill our architects here and designers with a kind of level of education on what's possible on these sites. And also examples that you can point to clients and the public and say, this was possible in this place. And so we think this is possible here, and so, and I think ultimately one last thing, and I'll end, is that, of course it's expensive. And that's always another question, like at what cost and whose pocketbook? But I think fundamentally what we do need to do a better job in this country is seeing the value of investment in public space and civic amenities and our own history in a way that, money shouldn't be the driving question. Of course, it always is a question. And in fact, the return on investment, a lot of these sites has proven to be tremendous. The Rohe Museum complex saw 2 million visitors in its first 10 years in a industrial city that is not a kind of center of tourism. It's not Munich, it's not Berlin, it's not Hamburg and so forth. So, I think like to see the value and that supersedes, just these kind of questions that we get bogged down about related to expense is also just an American, a paradigm shift in sort of American values that I think has needed addressed for a long time and still does.
No, that is 1000% true. And I just, on a joking note, I'm so glad you said the word pocketbook, because I said pocketbook the other day and I made myself laugh so hard I snorted. So yeah, pocketbooks are important. Greg, this was absolutely lovely. Like, I would like to have conversations with you on the regular. This is a fun time. Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. We are recording all of these. MassMocha, the great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, great.
I'm from Albany. I've been to MassMocha, spent half my life in MassMocha. We are recording these sessions and we'll be making those available later, so you can check this lecture again. But with that, have a great rest of your evening. Again, Greg, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christiana. It was great. Thank you.